Let me start with just a couple of basic logistical things. I figure I will talk until about 4. Does that sound about right? And then we can have discussion afterwards. Okay, next thing, the young lady in green, can you hear me okay back there? Everybody else okay with the sound? Okay, final thing, all of you are very proficient speakers of English. However, I was raised speaking American. So if I need to work on my diction or speak more clearly, please let me know. Okay, with those preliminaries out of the way, I'd also like to say thanks for the sponsors of my appearance here, the Fulbright Nehru Fellowship Program, the U.S. India Educational Foundation, and particularly to my old friend Shrikant, who occurred to me that we've known each other for 30 years now. So time flies, but thank you very much again for inviting me here today. The topic I described in general terms is economic valuation of biodiversity and ecosystem services. But as you all probably know, this is a very broad topic. Let's start with a couple of recent reviews that have been done of it. A high-profile activity was a more than 600-page report prepared recently by Sir Partha Dasgupta for the UK government. World Bank has also produced a 2021 report, Economic Case for Nature, which is compiling recent evidence. What are these reports focused on? Well, they're about biodiversity. And what is biodiversity? Well, somebody once described biodiversity as what you get if you take the logical out of biological diversity. A bit of a double entendre, of course. They were saying that when you reduce it to a buzzword or a popular phrase, you may lose focus on what it is that you want to concentrate on. And in fact, E.O. Wilson, who edited the famous 1989 US National Academy of Science report on biodiversity, supposedly found the term too glitzy and was afraid that it was going to not have people take the subject seriously. But it is important to have a compact expression for a serious concern. And the serious concern is that many people are worried that we are in the midst of a 6th extinction crisis. In the geological record, you can find 5 previous episodes of mass extinction caused by a volcanic or astronomical cataclysm. Many people now think we're in a 6th phase of extinction caused by the excessive dominance of one species, us. So approaching biodiversity from a variety of perspectives, including economic perspectives. Let me just quickly run down some important prominent contributions. We have World Bank Changing Wealth of Nations reports, UK National Ecosystem Assessments, the project on the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity done with UN funding in the early part of the 2010s. Before that, Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and then probably one of the seminal pieces was work done by late David Pearce and Dominic Moran on economics of biodiversity. I'd also recommend to you, if you haven't run across some recent survey papers, Nick Hanley and Charles Perrings have a good piece in the annual review of resource economics, another piece by Paul et al., and a piece for the US Forest Service by Binder et al. And then in addition to these survey pieces, compilation articles, so forth, there are a variety of data sets, platforms, models, modeling packages that typically go by a series of acronyms such as ARIES, Artificial Research for, I can't remember what the I stands for, but Ecosystem Services, INVEST out of the Stanford-based National Capital Program, the Environmental Valuation, Resource Inventory, et cetera. So I've just gone through the fact that there has been a tremendous bit published on biodiversity. So then that leads the question as to what is it that I might most usefully survey in the time I have with you? Well, again, there is a lot published. Google these sort of terms, you get 500,000 hits. You look into the scholarly literature, you get 1,000 papers on economic value of ecosystem services, over 500 economic value of biodiversity. Related terms give you a similar number of hits in the research, and these terms are not necessarily inclusive. I did exact match services or searches, and among other things, it didn't turn up many of my own papers in which I didn't happen to have this string of terms. So again, there's a lot published on these topics, and what is it that I might emphasize here? Well, I think the place to start may be with this observation, which seems to be made repeatedly, but continues to be true. Recent survey paper by Unai Pascal for the International Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services notes again that despite increasing calls for considering valuation and policy decisions, scientific documentation shows less than 5% of published valuation studies report uptake in policy decisions. So this research isn't having as much impact as one might like it to have, and what are the reasons for this? Well, I would say that the reasons continue to be that the quality of the research is problematic. And the research that purports to be about valuation sometimes stops short of coming up with useful advice on valuation. So more than a decade ago, a survey said that less than a third of studies provided a sound basis for their conclusion. A couple of years later, a major survey of water-based ecosystem services said that they didn't take it all the way to completion. A few years ago, Linus Bloomquist and I did a chapter for an edited volume in which we did a close investigation of 28 papers that appeared in one of the major databases. And we found that despite the fact that they were saying that they were doing economic valuation, they weren't heeding the basic tenets of doing economic valuation, using replacement cost instead of avoided cost. That is, what's the cost of replacing something, without reference to whether or not anybody would pay to incur that replacement cost. And then another major problem is not considering marginal values in studies. And since we're all economists here, right? Since we're all economists here, we all know that value is determined on the margin. So saying what the total value of something is isn't going to be very useful. My former colleague, Mike Toman, said in remarking about the famous Costanza study done in the late 1990s, I think most of you are probably familiar with this, value of the Earth's biodiversity and ecosystem services. Mike was asked for his opinion on this, and he characterized it as a serious underestimate of infinity. The reason being that none of us would be here if we didn't have the services of the rest of nature. And this is what Costanza and his co-authors were purporting to value, and that was sort of a nonsensical undertaking. Again, I'm afraid that the situation may not have improved as much as we would like in recent years, although I must say that even in the time I've been here, I've been really both encouraged and a little embarrassed, encouraged to see the work people are doing and embarrassed that I wasn't aware of more of it. So there is more good work being done, and I know many of you are in the process of doing this work. So maybe I shouldn't be quite as pessimistic as in my second to last statement here, but I do think there's still a lot of work that is going into the public sphere that isn't as well thought through as might be. And in particular, a lot of what's being done on valuation these days is not original. People familiar with the term benefit transfer? Others? Huh. Okay, good. I'm saying something that's new to you then. Benefit transfer is the idea that you take a value that was estimated in a different study and you transfer it to a different context. Well, one of the other things we all know as economists is that since value is determined on the margin, the total amount of something providing something of value is going to be very important in determining its marginal value. And so you should not be transferring benefits without taking account of the relative abundance of the thing whose value you are purporting to benefit. So this is going to be one of the concerns I think we really have to think about carefully in relying on benefit transfer, as a lot of studies do. Okay, now I'm going to say a little bit, I think after saying I've known Shrikant for more than 30 years now, you can tell I'm getting to be part of the gray-haired part of the profession, so I'm going to give sort of my impressions of having worked in these areas for decades now and share some of my views from the start so you can know where I'm coming from. I will certainly agree that biologically diverse natural habitats are at many times and in many places worth more alive than dead. There are certainly many, many cases in which it makes more sense to preserve biologically diverse natural habitats than to convert them to other uses. But in other cases, they may not be. And we need to be careful in communicating the distinction and being careful about conveying values. And again, I think this goes to the utility of the economics profession in making policy decisions is, are we communicating credible estimates of value? We also have to think about to whom our value is accruing. In some cases, we might argue that relatively tight-knit communities may not be appreciating the value that naturally diverse ecosystems could offer them. But in other cases, relatively tight-knit communities may be appreciating the value that the diverse natural ecosystems offer them and decide to do something else with them. So we need to think about the costs, the opportunity costs to small groups, to the extent that small groups are maintaining particular forests or bodies of water or bays and inlets and sort of things. In some cases, those costs borne by small groups maybe should be compensated by larger groups. If a local community is providing habitat for an endangered species, for example, the global community should provide compensation for them doing that. But we have to be realistic about who's getting benefits, who's bearing the costs. A couple of things I would note as going to be recurring themes. We all know that there are externalities involved in preserving diverse natural communities. We all know that if one person or community decides to preserve a forest, not cut trees, not catch fish, whatever, they may be providing externalities for others. But that's certainly not the end of the story. The fact that one is providing externalities for others then means that we have to think about, well, what is a plausible estimate of the value of those externalities? And is conservation, in fact, or is greatly increased conservation, in fact, a natural implication of the existence of the externalities? This is something that all of us should have gotten in our first week of microeconomics, but it continues to amaze me as to how often it comes up, and in some cases, how little it's appreciated. The diamonds in water paradox explains a heck of a lot when we're thinking about diverse natural ecosystems. If the services provided by those ecosystems are abundant, then they're not going to be valuable. As they become more scarce, they're going to become more valuable. So we want to think about conditions for abundance and scarcity. This is going to, this idea of the importance of the diamonds in water paradox and thinking about biodiversity is going to lead to another idea that I'm going to be emphasizing at several junctures in these talks, is that there is often a sort of paradox of efficiency. If a natural ecosystem is very effective in providing a service, then a small amount of that ecosystem can provide a relatively abundant amount of that service, and therefore preserving larger areas of the ecosystem may only serve to drive down the marginal value of the service being provided. So again, we're going to run into, in several cases, this notion of a paradox of efficiency. We can make a very compelling case in some instances for preserving small areas of habitat, but that case may go away as we try to scale the provision of the services. Okay, these are all, I think, fairly straightforward observations. And again, I don't think they're going to come as surprises to any of you. So why underscore these points and why try again to emphasize them in an effort to better lead to informing policy decisions? Well, one is simply that when we can make strong arguments, we certainly should. You know, if you can say in a certain case, as in some of my work I have, that yes, it makes sense to preserve fairly extensive areas of natural habitat to filter out pollutants, then yes, we should do that. And in some cases, we can say it makes sense to preserve fairly extensive areas of coastal vegetation to provide storm protection. When we can make that case, we should do it. So we definitely should. And this is just the fundamental argument for doing good cost benefit analysis. We want to influence policy, we should do credible cost benefit analysis. And if we can extend the consensus on these best practices, then we can make our compelling arguments stronger. Now, again, I think all of us as economists are aware of basic ideas such as the diamonds and water paradox, but we may sometimes need to tell our friends in other sciences that these principles are important as well. Another reason for thinking carefully about these values is I think we also have to realize the limitations of the things we can value. And I think, well, I'm always fairly confident in saying I'm going to disappoint some of you in what I say, but I'm going to predict that I'm going to disappoint some of you in what I say, and that I don't think I can go very broad in terms of really all of the values of biodiversity we should care about. I'm going to focus largely on the services that could be at least credibly estimated in a variety of market-related contexts. Now, there are many, many other reasons for which we should care about biodiversity, spiritual reasons, aesthetic reasons, that we should be concerned about passing along to our descendants a world as diverse as we got. It's going to be difficult to make those arguments in clear economic terms, I think. And so we need to be, in my opinion, careful about presenting the distinction between what we can and can't value clearly. Also, another theme that's going to come up here, and this is sort of personally frustrating because I run across this idea in my work all the time, is that the implications of valuation are going to have important implications for how we organize landscapes. And if we can show that local ecosystem services should lead to less intensive management of local landscapes, are we okay then with the implication that we are going to have more landscapes around the world, less intensively managed, but essentially used for human purposes such as agriculture, residences, recreation? There's going to be some interesting trade-offs between thinking about valuation at small scale and what it's going to mean for the composition of the landscape at very large scale. The thing that I think is most important, this is always something that comes back to me when I come to India and travel, generally speaking, outside of the United States and other wealthy countries, is that we as economists also have moral obligations. And our moral obligations are basically to think carefully about advice that we give that may have really fundamental implications for people's lives and livelihoods. So let's review a little bit of natural science and social science here. There is a latitudinal gradient in the distribution of life forms around the planet. You could illustrate this in a number of ways. Basically, what that means is that the diversity of life forms tends to be more compressed into the middle latitudes, into the tropics. Tropical countries, by and large, have more biodiversity. And so you're seeing some exceptions here, coast of Florida and Baja California, for example, the Anglophone regions of Australia and New Zealand. Some areas in Europe are considered to be biodiversity hotspots. Incidentally, there's various different ways of measuring this, but in this notion of where endemic species are most at risk, we can identify some places that are fairly wealthy, but most of these spots are concentrated in relatively poor areas of the poorer developing world. So the Andes, the coasts of Brazil, the African rainforest, the east coast of Africa. Whoops, got to be careful what I touch there. Whoops, I went the wrong way. Okay, so anyway, I'll step back so as not to do that again. Africa, South and Southeast Asia. Anyway, what we're talking about is where biodiversity tends to be concentrated, and where it tends to be concentrated tends to be where wealth isn't concentrated. So one thing of which I am painfully aware when I go around the world and talk to people about biodiversity conservation is that people like me have a strong temptation to tell people who can't afford to, or may not be as easily able to afford, to preserve natural ecosystems, that that's what they should be doing. Now, if we can make a compelling case that their lives are actually going to be better off for doing that, then sure, of course we should give them that advice if we honestly believe it. But we also have to be very careful that we're not wish casting, as it were. Wouldn't it be nice if these people's lives were better off if they preserved biodiversity? Well, let's make sure that lives would in fact be better off before we give them that advice. And again, this is something that has bothered me. For example, this is now a dated quotation, but some leading conservation scientists wrote about 15 years ago about nature for nature's sake resonates only with the already converted, that is, wealthy people around the world. But the billions who live in world, or the billion who live in world poverty, remain unwilling or unable to move, by move meaning conserving biodiversity. So what do we have to do to make these people partners in conservation? We need to use ecosystem service approach to motivate and enable them. Again, if we can make a good case that they should be motivated and enabled, that's good. But we had better be confident of that advice before we tell people to, in some cases, literally take food out of their children's. I feel like I'm echoing. In some cases, literally take food out of their children's mouths to preserve biodiversity. So again, should we be providing the best information we can when we can? Of course we should. But should we be placing the burden on poor communities when we're not sure? Of course we should not. And again, the fact that externalities may, you want to tell why it's doing that? I guess. Okay. Still sound okay to you all? That was I think that's a difference between an Indian and an American. America would go like this if it's yes. Okay. Well, it's just a little bit echoey, but if it's okay with you, it's okay with me. How many vote to turn it down?
Are you okay? Or
I guess I would prefer to have it turned down a bit if you don't mind. Okay, moving right along. And again, we have to think about, if we really are thinking largely about global externalities, then maybe we should be emphasizing global externalities and transfer payments between the rich and the poor, rather than coming up with ecosystem service arguments if they don't help the poor. Again, I'm not saying that we can't come up with ecosystem service arguments that may help the poor, but we just have an obligation to be careful about them. Okay, with that by way of motivation, let me outline what I plan to do over the next, well, cumulative 2.5 hours of today, Wednesday, and Friday. Today is going to be an overview of how biodiversity and ecosystem services affect human welfare and how economic values might be estimated. After that, I'm going to go through several examples of empirical work looking at values of biodiversity, offer some comments on them, and consider some or some representative values. Then third hour, I plan to be consideration of the values, thinking about when ecosystem services are complementary and when they may not be. One of the things I think that often comes out in the conservation literature is there are flood protection ecosystem services, there are pollination ecosystem services, there are existence values, there are pest control ecosystem services. Let's just add them all together. Well, sure, we should add them all together, but we should also take into account that they may occur on different scales. To the extent that they occur on different scales, we're back in the diamonds and water paradox. Things may be abundant on one scale, scarce on another. We don't want to mix up estimates that arise from different levels of abundance or scarcity. I'm going to talk a little bit about the use of biodiversity estimates in growth of macroeconomic models, particularly with reference to the recent Dasgupta report. I'll say a little bit more about benefit transfer, and then if all goes according to plan, I'll wrap up by talking about fundamental uncertainty. What do we do? Many of you are probably aware of the late Martin Weitzman's work on uncertainty in climate policy. We could talk about some of the same issues with regard to uncertainty in biodiversity policy. What do we do when we don't know what our grandchildren's marginal utility is going to look like? I'm going to largely leave out stated preference analysis for reasons that I will go into in a little bit. Also, I don't think I have to emphasize this to this group, but I'm going to entirely leave out ecological footprints, replacement cost as distinct from avoided costs, as these notions are largely incompatible with the decision-making under constrained optimization as understood by economists. And again, since we are all of the same tribe of economists here, I assume that we're probably all on board with that. I also get very tired, I guess. What's the right word? I lose patience for all of the terminological variations that one runs across in discussions of biodiversity and ecosystem services and nature-based solutions and nature services for people, and a whole range of different terminologies for talking about the services and goods provided by diverse natural ecosystems. I'm going to largely avoid those terminological issues and just say biodiversity and ecosystem services, because largely what we're talking about is what sort of decisions we as a society make, or we as individuals within a society make about what to preserve. So we're not necessarily going to be talking about fine terminological distinctions between different types of ecosystem services so much as somebody wants to cut down a hectare of trees somewhere. How are we going to put a value on that hectare of trees if it's left standing relative to if it's cut down? And I don't think we need to get into deep terminology to discuss those things. So again, the key questions: what are the consequences of these choices for human welfare? A couple of final introductory remarks. I got to say, I feel a little bad about this because I'm fairly confident that there are probably several of you in this room who could give at least a compelling series of lectures as I can on the subjects I'm going to cover here. So I don't want to monopolize all the time just talking myself, but at the same time, I do have a set of stuff I'd like to get through. So
having to give little bit of introduction and weak and strong sustainability, really motivate our students who are so much in developmental economics.
I am going to respectfully defer that to the final session because that's where I've got it coming up. Just real quick though, weak and strong sustainability, raise your hand if you're familiar with the idea. Okay, let's do it the other way around. Raise your hand if you're not familiar with the idea. Raise your hand if you're too embarrassed to say. Okay, weak and strong sustainability. Strong sustainability, and correct me if I'm misstating this. Strong sustainability is the idea that basically we need to maintain the constellation of biological and other assets that we've inherited. We need to keep everything. If we don't keep everything, we're not sustaining the world. Weak sustainability is the economist notion, largely I think the economist notion, that we need to maintain an equal value or equal or greater value for later generations. We can substitute out machines for trees if we can create equivalent values in machines as we had in the trees we cut down. Again, I'll come back to this later on, and I'm not sure it's going to come up in detail yet, but I'll come back to it later on. So forging ahead in the interests of erring on the side of moving through material. So again, I'll try to leave plentiful time at the end, but I'm going to sort of forge through the material. I will, though, be happy to take clarifying questions. If I've said something that doesn't make any sense, which I'm likely to do fairly frequently, then please ask me clarifying questions. Although I would like to avoid the deep philosophical questions that I would be happy to take up with you afterwards. But I think as economists, again, we are probably all familiar with the idea that because people have to make decisions about what's going to be preserved in the world, our perspective is necessarily anthropocentric. So I'm not going to belabor that point, but I'm not going to do a lot of deep consideration about what other perspectives I might bring. However, I would be very happy to talk for as long as anybody would like afterwards about any questions that come up in the course of these presentations. Okay, moving right along, let's think about what biodiversity and ecosystem services are and how they affect welfare. So biodiversity has been defined in a variety of ways. There's alpha, beta, and gamma diversity, which I don't quite remember the distinctions between them. But basically, one has to do with the number of individual separable elements, whether those are alleles, the components of genes that lead to the coding of production of proteins in living organisms, or the organisms themselves, or even the biomes. So one idea is just the sheer number of these different forms of life. Another idea of diversity has to do with the relative abundance of them, with the presumption being that more diverse, less concentrated set of species in the world or types of biomes in the world is a more concentrated and less diverse group is less desirable, at least when that reduction in diversity is driven by human actions. Species counts are often used as operational measures. When people talk about how would you measure biodiversity, most people would, off the top of their head, if they had an opinion, say number of species. That's what it often shows up in the biological literatures. And then in making policy decisions, we generally contemplate actions that affect the diversity in either sense. I've just put up the absolute numbers of different things or the relative abundance of the different types of things. So we're thinking about actions that affect the naturalness of these systems, and then how the naturalness of the systems determines the degree to which they provide things that humans like. So how does biodiversity affect well-being? One is that we just have intrinsic concern about the survival of the organisms we share the world with and that we inherited from previous generations. And so we may have a willingness to pay to preserve just that essential diversity of the world. Another way in which biodiversity can be valuable is the harvest of particular products. So we could think about fisheries, timber harvests, even agriculture in some ways. I'm going to focus, though, on a couple of other elements. One is the use of biodiversity in giving rise to valuable new products. So not as species or not as individual animals or plants as rival goods for consumption, but as templates for the production of other products. And then I'll devote a fair bit of what I'm going to say, particularly in the second hour of these lectures, to the way naturally diverse ecosystems can enhance their productivity or regulate managed systems. So pollinators that fertilize crops, or again, the example of forests and coastal rivers that prevent erosion, treat wastes, or protect against storms. So again, I'm going to devote most of my attention to these last couple. I think I'll just go through this really quickly. Familiar with the idea of separability of utility functions? Raise hand if not familiar with the idea of separability. Okay. Again, most of you too embarrassed to say, that's okay. So suppose utility is the form, our utility depends on some measure of biodiversity beta and a vector of consumption goods X. Consumption goods are purchase price P and we have income M. If beta isn't allocated in any market, how are we going to infer anything about people's willingness to pay for it? Well, one possibility is if it affects the marginal rate of substitution between goods that are offered in the market. So if maintaining a larger area of natural forest makes a place a more attractive tourism destination than many of you are probably familiar with, for example, travel cost models or random utility models, people making choices to visit places with more attractive amenities. The problem is if biodiversity doesn't enter into these the ratio of marginal utility. There's really not anything that market transactions are going to tell us about it. And so if the utility function is fully separable, then we're in what Myrick Friedman was referred to as a hopeless case. If it's not separable, if it does affect the marginal rate of substitution, then we have options such as travel cost models, and we can think about inputs into profit or into profit cost and production functions. Again, hopeless case if the utility function is completely separable. In that case, we can't use revealed preference. What could we do? Well, as a theoretical proposition, we can say there's an expenditure function. I think most of you are probably familiar with the notion of an expenditure function. So the change in the expenditure function with the provision of biodiversity is a theoretical measure of consumers' willingness to pay to preserve biodiversity. We've just said, though, that we can't get this information from any market transaction. What do we do instead? We ask people. So this is the whole area of stated preference. How much money would you give to maintain the number, to increase the number of tigers in the world? How much money would I have to give you if you were to agree that the number of tigers in the world were going to be reduced? I have various approaches to doing these sort of studies. Choice experiments. Yes.
We're using the word biodiversity as static sets. Like the utility function. Isn't it the case that, well, I don't know anything about the literature here, but is it the case that when you are talking about the pool of biological species, it's more or less very dynamic, maybe in a longer time span, but are we taking this in a static sense here because our time horizon is kind of limited, the rate of change of?
I think the quick answer to that is probably going to be yes. I think if we were going to talk about our concern for preserving the constellation of species in order to maintain evolutionary processes, it's probably so difficult to relate that to any current market transaction that we would be in the realm of stated preference and existence values, or at least very difficult to articulate market-based values. So you're right. For present purposes, I am going to focus on a much more limited perspective. Now, I'm not sure, maybe somebody else is more conversant with this than I am. The biologists say that the rate at which species go extinct is approximately 1 per million species per year in terms of background extinction rates, in terms of without human intervention. So if the rate at which species come into being is about the same rate, then we're not talking about rapid speciation. So I'll maybe come back to that, but let's just say for now, we're assuming a relatively static view of things. Okay, so choice experiments are trying to put this more in the context of familiar transactions for consumers. If you want to save the tigers, are you willing to pay more for your water bill, your electric bill, or your taxes or whatever? As I said, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on stated preference methods for several reasons. One is that it's a topic we could spend hours on its own, and I just don't think I could do justice to the issues. Another is, frankly, and this is a bigger philosophical issue that we could take up afterwards if anybody wants to. But Karl Popper's definition of a science is something that puts forward falsifiable hypotheses. And a criticism, I think, that remains of stated preference literature is it's not clear how strong a falsifiable hypothesis we can put forward. And there has been a lot of criticism of stated preference literature for reasons along those lines. Perhaps more to the point, though, stated preference studies tell us presumably what people would pay if we put it up to a vote. Well, for whatever reason, we're not generally putting conservation up to a vote. And a lot of the interest in demonstrating more concrete and tangible values of biodiversity ecosystem services is trying to make people appreciate those tangible values rather than relying on the political process, relying solely on a political process in which effective demand for conservation hasn't yet emerged. So I'm going to focus more on production functions. So when biodiversity enhances productivity, the benefit will be the implied factor price. And I think rather than go through all that stuff, I'll just say that it's always going to be the case that it will be the case under assumptions of rational profit maximization, that the implied factor price of biodiversity would be the value we'd assign to it. Again, I apologize for going through this with an audience of economists, but when you talk with audience of non-economists, somebody will always say, you're assuming that all people care about is profits, but as economists, we know that we can translate under idealized conditions, maximization of profits to maximization of a measure of social utility. So that's the assumption I'm going to proceed under. Now we can, I think, okay, I'll tell you what, I will go to the example first. And sorry, I think I've probably once again, geez, I really did. Okay. I had a lot of stuff there, didn't I? Okay, let's think about an example. And the example is going to be the enthusiasm for bioprospecting. And whoops, let's think about something that was a big issue when Shrikant and I were both young, which was the idea that biodiversity was going to be useful as a source of new products. So I don't know if anybody's ever heard of this. It's probably more or less ancient history now. In the early 1990s, there was a combination between Merck, which was at the time the world's largest pharmaceutical producer, and an organization known as the Instituto Nacional de Biodiversidad, National Biodiversity Institute of Costa Rica, in which the Costa Ricans were going to share samples of their abundant tropical rainforest plant and animal life, which Merck was then going to use as a source of new pharmaceutical products. Now, as many of you probably know, common pharmaceutical products like aspirin, quinine in India, neem-derived products, all come from natural sources. And in more recent years, promising anti-cancer drugs, antihypertensive drugs, other useful drugs have come from natural plant and animal sources. So the argument was that this is going to be a win-win-win proposition, that the world was going to get new pharmaceutical products from exploiting the sample collections of Costa Rican rainforests. Costa Ricans were going to get economic benefits from selling access to their samples of resources. In fact, one of the executives in the NBO said, Costa Rica would soon be making more money from selling its biological samples for pharmaceutical research than it would from selling coffee. Costa Rica sells a lot of coffee. So there was going to be economic benefits coming out of it. And then the third aspect of it was that there was going to be conservation benefits. People would see that the standing rainforest was providing sources of new products. So they would say, well, with all these product values coming out of the standing rainforest, they got to be worth preserving. So we thought about this, colleagues Roger Sedgwick, John Reed, and I, and thought about a production function context for this. What are we producing with biodiversity? We're producing leads for potentially valuable new products. So what does a production function look like, or what does a profit function look like? Well, biodiversity is going to be an input into a stochastic, into a probabilistic production function. We don't know for sure whether or not a particular leaf from a particular plant is going to be a cure for, say, COVID, but we can test it and find out. So we have all these potential leads. Suppose it costs C to test each of them. Suppose R, let R be the payoff in the event of the product discovery. Now, key point, suppose that P is the probability that any one of these natural product leads is going to lead to, let's say we're looking for a drug that's going to be effective against COVID. Suppose P is the probability that any species of plant we pluck out of the Costa Rican rainforest at random is going to lead to the development of a COVID cure. Well, then the value of having a collection of N species to test is, well, I guess I should have probably gone through this in more detail, but the one focus on the 1 minus 1 minus P to the nth part of this. Got to be careful not to touch that, don't I? The 1 minus P to the nth power, remember P is the probability of finding something. 1 minus P is the probability of not finding something. 1 minus P raised to the power N, where N is the total number of species you have to conduct the research over, is a probability of not finding anything among all of the things you have to search over. Subtract that from 1, that's the probability you do find something. For reasons it's a little bit complicated, or ignore the C term for now. If you ignore the C term, then basically it'd be the reward in the event you found something times the probability you find something. Now, what's happening to that probability as a function of the number of species? I'll just say in passing that you can use this approximation. So this is approximately 1 minus P to the nth power, the probability you don't find something. So what's the interpretation of what would be the value of a marginal species? What would the Costa Ricans be willing to pay to save one more of their species in their rainforest? And again, being very careful about terminology here, this isn't in any sense the philosophical existential value of biodiversity. This is the value of biodiversity for this purpose, the value that they're trying to monetize in this case. Well, what's the value of marginal species? This is what you would expect to get from testing the final species. Probability you make a hit times the value of the product if you find it, minus the cost of testing the last one. What's this? Well, it's the probability you're actually going to want to test the last one. Because if you've gotten all the way through the collection, or if you've gotten all the way through the collection of species, it means that none of the others had it. If any of the other plant samples that you were going to test had the products of interest, then you wouldn't need to test the final species. So probably you're going to need to go all the way through the sample and reach the last one. Interesting observation on this. If P were a very, very small number, then your expected payoff when you got to the end of the collection would be very low. But if P were not a very, very small number, and N is a big number, and N is in the hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions worldwide, then the probability you're going to get all the way through all the things you have to sample and not find what you're looking for is small. So what we did was we noted that the value of the marginal species as a function of the probability along the horizontal axis of making a hit and the number of species over which testing can be conducted is a single peak function. We can find the maximum of that function. And using that approximation I talked about a moment ago, we can find that the value of the marginal species is maximized by basically working out this expression. And then using data on the cost of pharmaceutical research, value of new products and the expected pace of new product demands, and an admittedly somewhat ad hoc assumption on return on investment, we found an upper bound of the value of marginal species of $10,000 US. So that was our estimate of what the Costa Ricans might be willing to pay to preserve another species. Now, that's still not getting at what we would like to know in terms of making societal decisions, though, because we typically don't go out and find a species at random and say, I'm going to make you go extinct. What we do instead is we cut down trees. When we cut down trees, we reduce the area of habitat available for species to grow. And our ecologist friends have a variety of ways of modeling that. One of the most common used is suppose that there's a power relationship associating the area of habitat maintained to the number of species maintained in that area of habitat. The constant alpha I varies across different areas, but is an interesting empirical regularity that the beta parameter, the power parameter, tends to be about a quarter. So my colleagues and I used that to say that we could get an estimate of the change in number of species per unit area. Then we also had an estimate of the change in, or the value of the marginal species. We could combine that, relate it to the values of hotspots. Remember the map I showed of the hotspots around the world. Could say in one of those hotspots around the world where there's a certain amount of endemic biodiversity species that appear there and nowhere else, what would be the value of preserving a hectare of land? In 1995 dollars, it was between about 20 US cents and $20. The value of the land itself tended to be in the hundreds or thousands of US dollars. And so we thought this was a compelling argument for saying that value of biodiversity for new species development wasn't that high. Let me just quickly wrap up here by saying what I took away from this, and I perhaps overlearned the lesson, but let me give you my impressions. As is always the case with academic work, we published our paper. A couple of years later, some other people published a paper revisiting our results, came up with radically different answers than ours. A couple of years after that, some other people revisited our critics' results, came up with radically different answers from theirs, said that we were probably right. I don't know. But in the meantime, back in the real world, I revisited some of this for a recent article in, I think this is in a popular press journal called Anthropocene, and basically said that while we academic scribblers were having these squabbles about whose model was right, an interesting thing was happening in the real world, nothing. Because in the real world, in biomerc deal lapse, nobody's made a lot of money from bioprospecting, regrettably. And the history of bioprospecting supports the economic proposition that new research leads aren't scarce. Okay, I think I am nearing the point at which I promised to stop, and I skipped over a heck of a lot of stuff there. So I guess I'll decide how much I want to come back to next time. But let me just wrap up by saying that what I want to do for most of the time next time is move on to other examples, so more recent examples, and see if this sort of result arises, or if we get different results, if we can point to the sort of the ways in which we could measure the scarcity of the resources involved in such a way as would give us a good sense of what the value of preserving natural areas are. So next time, what I hope to do is go through an interesting paper on the use of forest areas for water purification, something that you often run across in the ecological literature, and I'm sure you've run across popular press references to it as well. Use of forest and other vegetated areas for coastal and storm protection. And then another one that you may often hear about is pollination. Is it important to preserve adjacent natural areas in order to provide pollinators that are going to serve crops and enhance the productivity of agricultural production? So that's my plan for next time. I feel like I have run through everything at probably too fast a pace, so I will reduce my number of slides by at least 2/3 for next time. But I'll stop the formal part now and open it up for any discussion.
Australia, they use